Around 10 years ago, I borrowed a friend's car to drive some family around countryside Japan, but the car clearly had some kind of problem. Despite being an automatic, it just wouldn't stop revving. So shortly after picking up the car, I turn around and go back to my friend's place. And when I tell him what's going on, he just bursts out laughing. He says, "Right, because it's not an automatic. It's an automatic manual mixed transmission. And you see this? You've got it set to the manual mode. It's been revving like crazy because it's been in first gear this whole time." Up until that point, I had only ever driven normal automatic cars. And that led me to think that this car had some kind of problem, but it just had a different kind of transmission, a completely viable one that I wasn't familiar with. And I can't even count the number of times that this kind of thing has happened to me as a foreigner living and working in Japan. The instances where an interaction left me completely confused or sad or frustrated, only for me to realize, often years later, that I had a fundamental misunderstanding of what was going on at the time. And every time this happens, I think to myself, if only I had known. If I had known, I wouldn't have felt like that. I definitely wouldn't have said that. I might still be working at that company. To be clear, not every negative experience foreigners have in Japan can be attributed to cultural misunderstandings. Not by a long shot. But there are many instances in which cultural misunderstandings cause frustration, and further instances in which this very frustration triggers a vicious cycle, a sort of negative feedback loop that can turn even the most bright-eyed, Japan-loving otaku bitter. I call this cycle the Japan trap, and today, and in some future videos, I'd like to use some personal anecdotes to explore its unique mechanisms. I want to look at the specific circumstances that constitute the Japan trap so that fewer people end up getting caught in it. And I'd like to start this mini-series with this, the Japanese concept of reading the air, or kuki o yomu. So we've all heard this phrase, which is again often translated as read the air, or read the room, read between the lines, or take a hint. But I'm kind of torn on these translations because while kuki o yomu can certainly be translated to, again, something like read the room, or take a hint, or read between the lines, I don't think that these translations effectively communicate exactly why it's so important to do this in Japan. I almost feel like a better translation might be solve the conflict before it happens. And here's why. During my time teaching English on the JET program, I had a website where I posted my creative writing. Most of the things that I wrote were short satirical pieces based on experiences I had as an American living in countryside Japan. For example, I wrote a 3-page script about the horror of Japanese supermarkets. That's actually where the script for this video comes from. Many of the initial videos that I posted on this channel were actually based on scripts I had written years earlier during my time on JET. Now, there was a section in the JET guidebook or the JET rulebook that said something along the lines of, if you have a website or a blog, don't post anything about your school or students. Japan takes privacy very seriously. I remember reading this at the beginning of my 3-year JET program contract, but something happened during those 3 years. You see, when I got my offer to teach on the JET program, it said, should you choose to accept this offer, you will be teaching at these middle schools. And I thought, perfect, because I'm not terribly good with younger kids. So I accepted and started teaching English at middle schools in rural Japan. However, at the beginning of my 3rd year on JET, English became a mandatory subject at elementary schools as well. And when this happened, I was told, starting next week, you will be spending half of your time at these elementary schools teaching all grades. And this was stressful not just for me, but for everyone. The other teachers at these Japanese elementary schools were almost as blindsided by this policy as I was. There wasn't a proper curriculum in place. And the students, of course, were less than thrilled to have some of their more enjoyable subjects or free time cut down to make room for English. And some students picked up on this chaos and did what kids often do in chaotic situations, which is try and test or maybe even expand their boundaries. Sometimes students would try and pants the new foreign teacher. Sometimes they would yell out in the middle of class about how bad the Japanese teacher's English pronunciation was. Once a student farted into their hands, called me over as if to ask a question, and released it into my face. Again, it was just chaos, so I wrote about it. I wrote a completely fictional piece in which I walked down the hallway of a made-up Japanese school with my made-up Japanese teaching partner and opened the door to the classroom. But what I see inside isn't the inside of a classroom, but the scene from an African safari. The rhinos are fighting, the monkeys are throwing things, the crocodiles are getting ready to bite. Now, I can't remember ever telling any of my Japanese coworkers that I had this website. I remember telling some of them that I liked to write and that I had a website, but I can't remember giving any of them the actual URL. I definitely did share the URL during my JET program interview back in the States though, as I used the website to showcase my Japanese progress, my love for Japan, and this small community I had fostered over the years. But again, I can't remember sharing the URL with my coworkers at these schools. Though to be clear, I may have. I may have done it and just forgotten about it as time passed and different teachers came and left, because it's very common in Japan for teachers to leave after only 1 or 2 years out of school. But I was in the wrong. I told myself that I was writing into the void, writing for a handful of friends back in the States and a few Japanese friends who were in Kansai and Tokyo, but it was a public website. If I wanted to write anything related to Japanese schools, I should have waited until my contract was up. Here's where we get to reading between the lines. I publish the piece Sunday night, go to sleep, then wake up the next morning and go into work. This day at one of my middle schools. And on my desk in the teacher's room is the JET guidebook, open to that section about blogging with the aforementioned section highlighted. And when I see this, I immediately look up and around the teacher's room, expecting someone to come over and say, "Dogen, we need to talk about that thing you published last night because it's not okay." But it never happened. The Japanese English teachers that I worked with at that school never mentioned it, nor did the vice principal, nor the principal. Every interaction I had with every teacher that day was completely normal. It also didn't come up at the after-school meeting or any of my regular visits to the Board of Education. To this day, I don't know who saw the website, who put the book on my desk, and which teachers from which schools knew about the piece. Had someone been reading my website this whole time? Did the Japanese consulate in Seattle pass down the URL to the local Board of Education? Or did one of the teachers at these schools know the URL because I had told them in passing 2 years earlier and simply forgotten about it? Again, I don't know because nobody ever confronted me about this. Nobody ever brought it up in any capacity. What I want to talk about, though, is not this roundabout method in which I was reprimanded, but my psychological reaction to it. How my misread of this situation created a broken transmission moment. You see, when this happened to me, I thought I understood Japanese culture. I had learned about it from my university professors, my textbooks, anime, manga, and movies. I had a degree in Japanese. I had learned the phrase kuki o yomu, and that Japanese people are very non-confrontational years before all of this. And I was taught it again during the JET training seminars. What I never learned, however, was the why. Why it's so important in Japan to read between the lines. Why Japanese people are so non-confrontational. I had the knowledge, but it wasn't anchored in anything. And because of that, when I was suddenly on the receiving end of that passive aggressiveness, I had a very adverse reaction to it. My American mind immediately went to, well, if there's a problem, then can't we just talk about it? Because now I feel like I don't know who I can trust. I feel like you're all watching me, but pretending you're not. I don't even know how much trouble I'm in. This Japanese way of doing things, of beating around the bush, is weird and wrong. The engine is clearly broken. I didn't realize that this wasn't a bug in the system, that the transmission was working fine, that there are multiple logical reasons for why this approach is often the better solution in Japan specifically. When the 3/11 earthquake hit approximately 14 years ago, the whole world marveled at how calm and collected Japanese people affected by the disaster were. But it's not a coincidence that Japanese people reacted this way. Earthquakes, oftentimes catastrophic, are part of life in Japan, and the culture has evolved accordingly to prepare for them. Prioritize the needs of the group. Don't step out of line. Resolve the conflict before it happens. Do these things so that the next time a catastrophe inevitably strikes, we can get up and running faster and make better use of our remaining resources. Do these things because in Japan, there's never been a lot of room for error. I hadn't heard these arguments. I had only heard the current state of Japanese culture. And I came from a very in-your-face culture, a culture that teaches its students to raise their hands and speak their opinions and later cast their votes. And we can afford to take more risks in the US because of the tremendous amount of land and natural resources the country is blessed with. There are so many entrepreneurial endeavors in the US, not only because freedom is written into the country's founding documents, but because there is more room for error. You see, I moved from a culture that says, just do it. It's better to ask for forgiveness than permission, to one that says, don't risk it. The nail that sticks out gets hammered down. And both cultures, both transmissions, are optimized for their respective vehicles. But when it came to disagreements, contentious situations, when the rubber was finally meeting the road, I'd only ever driven with an American transmission. So I couldn't understand that whoever put that book on my desk was probably trying to give me an out. They probably thought, by not reprimanding Dogen face to face, he can save some face. If I put this book here, Dogen will understand what we're asking. He'll read the air and take that piece down. And we can proceed peacefully, as if this never happened. We can avoid conflict. If anything, Dogen will appreciate this. And this is the takeaway point of this video. If you move to Japan, if you start living here and working here, making friends here and dating here, you'll inevitably run into similar circumstances. Situations where you find yourself asking, why didn't you just tell me? How could I have known that? Situations in which the proposed solution is so risk-adverse or the method of communication is so roundabout that you worry it could cause the opposite effect. And in some cases, it might. But what I'd like everyone, myself included, to try and remember is that it's not arbitrary. That behind every "why Japanese people" custom, behind the customs of every culture are hundreds of years of trial and error. That there's a method to the madness. Because in many cases, just the knowledge that there is a reason, well, that in and of itself can make the difference between, right, maybe I should zoom out and think about this from a different angle. And this is so obviously weird and backwards. Japanese society has faults, and many people, both foreign and Japanese, leave because of them. But sometimes people leave, rather tragically, because of one too many cultural misunderstandings, because of one too many broken transmission moments during those formative first years here. I hope to prevent this from happening. I hope that some people can learn from my past mistakes such that when they're in Japan and that engine starts revving, rather than assuming the worst and pulling a U-turn, they can shift up a gear and keep moving forward.